Welcome to the Writing Westward podcast. I'm your host, Brenden Rensink. Today we talk with Professor Beth Lew Williams about her new award-winning book, The Chinese Must Go: Violence, Exclusion, and the Making of the Alien in America. Writing Westward is a production of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. In each episode of this podcast, we host a conversation with an author or scholar of new work that explores the North American West. Disciplines will vary, the length of conversations will likely range dramatically, but we hope that each conversation will introduce you to new work, provoke as many questions as they provide answers, and inspire you to learn more about the North American West as a region, as well as its peoples, environments, histories, literature, and so forth. To learn more about the Redd Center, our programming, funding opportunities for research and events, find us at reddcenter.byu.edu. That's reddcenter.byu.edu. Follow Writing Westward on Facebook at Writing Westward Podcast or on Twitter at Writing West. You can find a list of podcast episodes and listen on the Redd Center website and clicking on the Writing Westward Podcast tab at the top of the page. You can also listen and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and various other podcast networks and distributors. Thanks for listening. In modern America, we hear plenty about immigration, citizenship, debates over who does and does not belong in the country. But too little attention is given to the complex history of how concepts of alien and citizen have evolved in the United States. Too many of us wrongly assume that the United States has always had clear categories of alien and citizen, legal and illegal immigrant, and so forth. But many of these ideas were in flux during the late 19th century and not well defined. Professor Beth Lew Williams' new book, The Chinese Must Go: Violence, Exclusion, and the Making of the Alien in America, published by Harvard University Press in 2018, confronts us with some of this history. Using examples in the American West from California, the Pacific Northwest, and elsewhere, Lew Williams presents how and when Americans politically organized against the Chinese attempted to regulate their movements across borders, regulate them here in the United States, passed various laws to deny them entry into the country, and violently expelled them from various American cities. She also relates the impact that these actions had on the Chinese themselves at the time and in the generations since. In relating late 19th century history of anti-Chinese movements, violence, law, and diplomacy, Lew Williams reveals key historical moments when America first began to grapple with alienage, to categorize groups that did not belong, and either exclude them from entering the United States or marginalize those already here. In addition to providing historical narratives to investigate these broad conceptual ideas, The Chinese Must Go also integrates the too often overlooked stories of anti-Chinese violence in the American West and integrates them into the broader American history of racial violence. All of this work provides important historical context for our present understandings of citizenship, alienage, and racial violence in American history. Beth Lew Williams is an assistant professor and a Philip and Beulah Rollins Bicentennial Preceptor in the Department of History at Princeton University. Her book that we'll talk about today, The Chinese Must Go, recently won the 2019 Ray Allen Billington Prize and the 2019 LSW Hawley Prize from the Organization of American Historians, as well as the 2019 Vincent P. DeSantis Book Prize from the Society for Historians of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. Professor Lew Williams, thank you for joining us on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
I appreciate you spending some time. You've been quite busy in the last few weeks, it looks like. You were just at a conference where the book won a number of awards, correct?
Yeah, I feel very fortunate for that. That was fun.
Yeah. I hope you can ride that high for a while. I had a lot of fun going through your books. I think listeners are going to be interested, and I think they're going to learn a lot of things they weren't aware of. And so I wanted to start first kind of with one of the big ideas of what you're trying to do in the book, trying to take this history of anti-Chinese racial violence and to weave it into the broader narrative of American racial violence, which is often focused on African Americans and Native Americans. Why is it you think that the Chinese and Chinese American experience hasn't been kind of a part of this broader narrative?
Well, I think when it comes to violence, there's some good reasons that it's not always been seen as part of the same history. Part of it is that when I look at the violence in the 19th century West against the Chinese, it looks really different than the violence that had been experienced by other racial minorities. So, for example, a lot of what I look at is California. And in California, just a few decades earlier, from the 1850s, 1860s, there had been, violence that was called at the time extermination against, the tribes in California, including the Yoki Indians. And if we look at sort of contemporaneous violence against African Americans in the South during Jim Crow, we have their sort of staggeringly lethal violence, particularly lynchings. This is this sort of spectacularly gruesome and performative violence. And the violence against the Chinese looks really different. And part of what I was trying to do in the book is to insist that what happens to the Chinese still is violence, because I think that if we imagine that violence in the 19th century looks like either lynching or sort of military campaigns or militia campaigns against Native Americans, we're going to miss what happens to the Chinese. So in the mid 1880s, what I see is I think it's 168 communities across the West that I was able to document. There were these expulsions of the Chinese. Some of them are lethal. Some people are killed. But most of the violence was designed to push Chinese community out of neighborhoods, out of towns, out of cities. And so instead, the tactics tend to be things like arson, harassment, threats, driving out campaigns, rounding up all of the Chinese and marching them out of town. And it looks like a really different thing. So I think that's one of the reasons
Yeah,
that
so it's a little bit less lethal, and so then maybe it's read as not as overtly
yeah.
violent.
But I think it's also about sort of the larger place of Asian American history within U.S. history. I think that there are only a few key moments that Asian American, experiences tend to sort of pierce the bubble of the mainstream dominant narrative of the United States.
So in the U.S. history narrative class in college, you have Japanese internment,
Yeah, you
and
have
then
Japanese
a few other
internment.
moments.
Yeah, Chinese railroad workers. There's very few actually where um, in a broad survey, Asian Americans would appear in a lot of classrooms. And so I think part of that marginalization is, more broad, not just this topic.
I've been noticing this on Twitter recently. I'm trying to remember who it was that was posting about it, but over the course of a couple weeks, an immigration historian had been posting some infographics, like screenshots from, CNN or something, that was showing some data about, I think it was immigration numbers or numbers that were parsing out things by race in America. And you have all the categories except for Asian Americans. They were left off in
Yeah.
all these infographics. So it's part of this broader issue, you think?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's certainly true in contemporary politics. Often when they, have exit polling data, they don't even have a category for
Yeah.
Asian Americans. So I think it's true. Asian Americans continue to stay sort of outside of I don't know, our memory of American history, but also sort of the dominant discourse in some ways. Um, and I think that is very linked to the history that I study. So it's sort of it's a product of this history that
Yeah.
the expulsions were effective, and then that the laws against Chinese and other Asian groups were ultimately effective, and so that this marginalization is related to the artificial keeping small of these groups.
Yeah, that was something that I hadn't necessarily considered of, what narratives of violence we inherit and we talk about and which ones we don't, as a result of people surviving that violence. Or in the case of the Chinese, not necessarily surviving, but surviving in America. And the expulsions were very effective. Many Chinese were driven out, and those remnant communities which may have otherwise maintained the historical memory of some of these events sometimes are lost, right?
Yeah, I focus in particular on Tacoma, which
Hmm.
I think is an interesting example of this. Because so the Tacoma expulsion, it's hard to tell exactly how many Chinese were in Tacoma in Washington Territory before the expulsion, but
And
the
this is
estimates around.
1885.
Yeah, it's in 1885. Approximately 800 Chinese were driven out of Tacoma. It's hard to tell because that was sort of a hub for workers, so they were often the population was going up and down. Uh, about 800 Chinese were driven out first through harassment and then through a roundup and march through town. And so the census 5 years later in 1890 records no Chinese, but so does the same in Tacoma. But the census stays that way for decades. The Chinese don't return to Tacoma for, into the 20th century. And so this expulsion wiped out what was actually two Chinese neighborhoods and a large population in this small growing city, and it had a lasting effects. And it's interesting. I think Tacoma is particularly interesting because there's a 21st century movement to remember this history in Tacoma, and some local
There's like a
people.
Chinese garden park,
Yeah,
right?
they created a park and a garden in Tacoma, but as part of that, trying to create sort of public memory, public history, they tried to find descendants of the Chinese that were driven out, and they actually tried to also find descendants of the vigilantes who drove them out, since their names were so publicly available.
And
'Cause
celebrated at the time
yes, and
by some.
yes, there are
Yeah.
photos of them, and because they celebrated their participation in these expulsions. But they were able to find no one who claimed relation to the vigilantes, which might have its own reasons, but they also couldn't find any Chinese descendants. And so that gives a sense of that those people expelled were, many of them may have returned to China, but they also may have spread out across the U.S. West, and their stories were not recorded.
This is part of a broader issue about some of these early Chinese experiences in America. I know there was a big project ongoing, probably still ongoing at USC, trying to recover sources and invoices from Chinese railroad workers.
I think you're thinking Stanford,
Oh,
actually.
Stanford, yes, it is Stanford. It's
Yeah.
an English or American Studies professor there.
Yeah, so I've been a little bit involved in that.
Hmm.
It's Shelley Fisher Fishkin
Yes.
and Gordon Chang. I've been working at Stanford trying to understand the Chinese perspective on the building of the transcontinental railroads.
But it's hard to find these sources. So what kind of obstacle does that present for you, or does it restrict the kind of story you were able to tell, or impact the kind of history you were able to relate?
Yeah, I think that it's hard for people to wrap their minds around how few sources we have produced by Chinese migrants in the 19th century. And that railroad project is a great way for people to sort of imagine it, because in that project there was a team of scholars. I think it's over 50, both in the United States and in China, across disciplines. So also archaeologists, anthropologists, and everyone was searching in archives in so many different ways to try to find sources from the Chinese themselves, in
Like
particular
letters they wrote
letters.
home, or yeah.
Yes. But they found nothing. We've published a book. They're actually having a celebration this week to commemorate the end of the transcontinental. However, we didn't find the, quote unquote Chinese voices. And
Zero, literally zero.
yeah, I mean, we found
Wow.
sources. I contributed and talked about a contractor, so but those workers, those Chinese railroad workers, they didn't find a single letter. We found lots of information about them, but not something they produced. And that, I think, gives you a sense of how hard getting that perspective is. In this book, I was looking a little later in the 1880s, And one of the ways that I try to get those Chinese sources is through testimony, because they did come into court, and they also were drawn into redress hearings. There were redress hearings for when the federal government was considering paying redress to China. And so we have these very rare, short testimony that talks about particular incidents, but it's very little.
Yeah, those are the most frustrating sources when they're so rich and but you only have one of them, and
Yes.
you know, and you wish that you could happen upon some treasure trove of a bunch more.
I know, but I mean, I don't know how you feel about this, but that's one of the reasons I like working in 19th century U.S. history instead of 20th century U.S. history. I think that it's fun the treasure hunt is
Yeah.
fun. And then when you find things, you get to spend time sitting with them. I think that a lot of 20th century history is just trying to get through the stacks of paper that
Yeah.
have been produced and kept. It's
Yeah,
so
well,
much.
my book goes all the way up into the 1970s, and I mean it goes back into the 1900s, and I did feel that with those early sources, you're forced to be creative with them, you're forced to sit and really think about them, whereas towards the end of my project, it's just I guess sifting through just the mountain of documents, and it's a very different process.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
there's probably benefits to both, but maybe we need to
Probably.
find a happy medium. One thing you brought up, which I hadn't considered, is this idea that, and I'd be curious how you respond to it in the book, but I think listeners would be interested. When people think about, all of kind of the mythologies of the West or the stereotypes about what the West was like in the 19th century, especially, people often talk about it as being a violent place, right? And
Yeah.
sometimes a place of hyper violence, of overtly violent, and that being one of its defining characteristics. And you bring up the point that some people might dismiss this anti-Chinese racial violence as just like, oh, well, the West was really violent, so this isn't anomalous necessarily, or isn't something worth, particular mention or unique investigation. How do you answer that?
I think that, yes, so the West was very violent. And I think that what strikes me about this violence is how clearly it was racially targeted and how broad I see it. So the scope, both the specificity of it and the scope. So through, although these are expulsions, they were systematic. And they spread across the West. And, I look at really just a period of 14 months in which um, oh, scores of communities are engaged in this. The expulsions are announced in advance in some way, and they're explicitly racial in that Chinese, whether male or female, rich or poor, long-term residents or newcomers are rounded up and targeted. I think that looks really different than the everyday violence of crime in the West, for
Hmm.
example, or like I said, other forms of racial violence. And I think that it's also significant to look at this violence altogether because of its effects. So I spent a lot of time in the book trying to say that there are multiple effects of anti-Chinese violence, some of which we might expect, and some of which are more unexpected. And so on a local level, a lot of this violence meant sort of what I call remapping the racial geography of the West. That is where the Chinese were able to live and work. That is on sort of on the ground level changing locally. But it also, I argue that the violence had effect on national immigration policy and that it had an effect on U.S. relations with China. And so that's another way in which I think that this violence needs separate consideration from just all of that, all of the
Yeah,
violence of the
there's so
West.
many other intersecting narratives and much broader context this is kind of unfolding within. That does cast it in quite different light. Well, let's talk about some of the reasons for this movement. I mean, I'm from Northwest Washington, so when you
Oh
talked
yeah,
about Sehome and Semiahmoo, and
Yeah.
places like that,
You know how to
I
pronounce them.
my ears perk up because that's my hometown.
Yep.
And you talk a lot about the some of the early movements of kind of attempts at restricting and regulating Chinese immigration and the frustration of these border officers up on the Canadian border, which is also great because when the general public thinks about borders and immigration and border enforcement, they generally look south, right? And
Yes.
most of your a lot of your book is looking north to the northern border. But what are the frustrations or the reasons that start organizing people into this anti-Chinese movement, which becomes an on-the-grounds grassroots movement, but also a political movement? What are some of the things that are fueling this or motivating it?
I of the mind that fundamentally this movement was about, racial beliefs. So the
The yellow
Chinese,
peril idea.
yes, yeah, um, the Chinese, a lot of it, and I say that to start out because a lot of the way that these vigilantes and then more broadly people that advocated Chinese exclusion talked about it is they talked about it in economic terms. They said Chinese are cheap labor, that they're coming in large numbers, that they're taking white men's jobs, that they were servile, that they were sort of slaves to Western monopolists. So a lot of this was articulated at the time through economic rhetoric.
So that's how they're framing
That's how
their.
they're phrasing it.
Now, are they
But I think
phrasing it like that at the moment or post expulsion or post violence as justification?
so. I think ahead of time, that the anti-Chinese movement. I mean, it started almost as soon as the Chinese arrived in the West in the 1850s, and it, reached a first peak in the 1870s, and then I look at this violent reincarnation in the 1880s. But there's surprisingly consistent rhetoric about the way, who the Chinese are and what they represent to America as these they describe them as alien invaders, as an invasion force.
Hmm.
And so, yes, at the time they articulated as economic. But I think that it's true that the Chinese were paid less than white workers in most fields. But of course, that also had to do with a racial prejudice at the time, that they were seen as expendable labor, not needing of a living wage. And they could be brought in as competition to white workers only because they were being underpriced on the market in
Yeah.
this sort of racially based dual wage system.
So there is an economic basis, but you think there's more there.
Yeah, there are repeated recessions in, across the nation, but in the West in the 1870s and then 1890s, and it's true that once the Transcontinental Railroad was connected, there was many more white workers that were flooding into the West, and therefore there was more competition for employment. It's just the Chinese were throughout this time targeted as the source of the problem of all of these much larger economic ills that were going on at the time. And I think that is based in a assumption that the Chinese were racially inferior, that they were servile inherently, that they were slave-like, and that they could have subsist in a way that white men could not. So I talk in the book about how sort of the main two tropes of the Chinese is that they were heathen coolies. Heathen was both a religious but also a racialized term that meant that they could not assimilate to American ways and American values. And coolies is that they were meant to be these unskilled, exploited workers.
So they're both too foreign, too alien, but then also damaging to the economy.
Yeah.
I mean, because there are lots of other ethnic minorities, working on railroads and in the mines. I'm more familiar like with lots of the mining going on down in Arizona, and there is some racial violence against some of these European ethnic minorities, from Southern or Eastern Europe, but the rhetoric around it is much less racial, much less
Yeah,
talk about kind of the real and existential threat of this specific immigrant population. And it comes out quite differently with the Chinese.
yeah. I'm convinced by, work by people like Linda Gordon who argue that, whiteness was a broader category in the West in the 19th century. It was more inclusive. So although we see a lot of strong nativist sentiment against ethnic Europeans in the East Coast, we see less of it in the West, where there are just fewer white men.
Hmm.
And so many people are not American born. So this white category is broader, but the Chinese are very much outside of it.
Yeah, they never fall within that. Whereas lots of
No.
other groups other places at the time and geographically are not within the white, kind of both legal and kind of just social construction of whiteness. The Chinese are never included in that.
Yeah.
What are some of the tactics then that this movement uses? And eventually I'd like to segue this towards kind of that legal history of first restriction and then eventually exclusion. But in the context of this kind of mid-1880s violence, you mentioned that sometimes they would warn population or communities ahead of time. They would threaten them to try to get them to maybe leave on their own, to self-deport maybe.
Yeah. And
Um,
in today's terminology, we might call it self-deport.
yeah. Are there other kind of key aspects of the tactics that they would use to try to kind of rid their community of the Chinese presence?
So in some places, they would go door to door and give the Chinese a deadline to leave. Um, in Tacoma, for example, they gave them about a month's notice that they should leave by November 1st, 1885. And it was 2 days after that, November 3rd, that they round up the remaining Chinese. We also see tactics that had been long-term forms of violence against the Chinese, things as simple as rock throwing,
Hmm.
smashed windows. A lot of the tactics against the Chinese were, to the vigilantes' minds, tactics that they could justify afterwards as either non-violent or just an extension of state force. So one of the things that allowed this violence, these expulsions, to spread across the West was the fact that vigilantes, both before and afterwards, would justify their actions as just an expression of what the federal government should be doing anyway, which is deporting the Chinese, enforcing the Restriction Act, the Chinese Restriction Act that had recently tried to restrict their migration. And so this rhetoric of that this was, in fact, lawful and justified and within an American method dictated in many ways the tactics. And so tactics that would be called in newspapers boycotts, for example. They would say, we're boycotting the Chinese. Sounds lawful when you write about it in the newspaper, but in effect, a lot of the times it was accompanied by violence and harassment, and by cutting off food supplies to the Chinese. And then often arson was a desired tactic because it was often unclear who actually had set fires.
Hmm.
So lots of Chinatowns burned, and then the newspapers would declare there was an unknown cause, or maybe the Chinese had set alight their own neighborhood. And this, again, was a way to expel the Chinese without declaring that something unlawful had occurred in the community.
Tell us. So you mentioned the early restriction efforts, and the federal government's kind of failing to put it into practice. Lay out the history of some of these early moments of attempts by the federal government to kind of answer, the demands of this growing movement to restrict Chinese immigration to the United States, and then get us up to then the eventual. And I know there's a lot of there's a lot of legal history here, but the eventual full Exclusion Act, because it's more of an
Yeah.
evolution of legal attempts, and a longer evolution I think many people realize.
Yeah, so when I started the book, I started trying to understand this violence that happened in the mid 1880s. And one of the reasons it seemed like a puzzle to me was that it happened 2 years after a law that is commonly known as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And so the way that scholars have written about this law in the past has been, in 1882, the gates were slammed against the Chinese, and that the law, that first law, the so-called Chinese Exclusion Act, was extremely effective. This is what scholars have said in the first few years. In fact, the federal government only recorded, 40 Chinese immigrants. I think it's in 1880 for 10 in 1885. So
But that's nonsense, right?
yes. So, but it was the reason that I found it so surprising that there would be so much violence if this law had suddenly kept out the Chinese. And so I spent a lot of time looking at the violence and trying to understand, the perspective of the people that participated in it. And a lot of what they talked about was the ineffectual nature of the anti-Chinese law, and they didn't even call it the Exclusion Act, which was striking to me. So the 1882 law at the time was known as the Restriction Act. It had a much more narrow intent, I think, than we remember today. And it was extremely ineffective in its first few years. It was poorly funded. There were very few customs officials that were assigned to enforce it. There were tens of thousands of Chinese that continued to enter the United States in the 1880s. And so this violence, this doesn't, of course, justify the violence, but it does explain why the violence could be so contagious, why there were so many communities across the West who felt justified in expelling their Chinese neighbors. They saw this violence, this expulsion, this encouragement to quote to self-deport,
Hmm.
as just enforcing what the federal government said it was going to do in 1882, but did not.
Yeah, so it's a type of vigilante justice that they felt had some authorization, right? This is what the federal government is trying to do. They're just not doing it well, so we'll do it for them.
Yeah, it's extra legal violence, right? Extra legal
Yeah,
as
yeah.
it's attempting to extend the reach of the state in the name of the state, as opposed to illegal violence that is imagined as contrary to the state will. So the violence was an attempt to it was not just to push these Chinese out of local communities. It was also to say this federal law is not working. We want not restriction, but true exclusion, and we want enforcement of it.
Yeah.
And eventually that's what happened. So the U.S. government first attempted to negotiate a new treaty with China because they knew that a true Chinese Exclusion Act would abrogate its treaties with China.
Yeah, I think this is something that I was not fully aware of the existing treaties we had with China. We gave them like some favored nation status. What was the term they used?
Yeah, most favored nation.
Yeah, which had opened the gates and doors because we were
Yeah.
desperate to have their doors open to us. And so we had kind of entered into a bilateral agreement. So how does the 1882 Restriction or Exclusion Act and then what they try to pass later, how is that running up against existing agreements?
Yeah, so we have to remember that this is the moment at which federal immigration policy was starting to take form in the United States. And so some of the givens that we assume today were not givens at the time.
Hmm.
So we assume today that Congress and the president would unilaterally set immigration policy and that foreign nations do not that this is part of U.S. sovereignty, and foreign nations should not dictate our ability to include or exclude immigrants. But at the time, though that was still under debate. And so what the United States had done was negotiated essentially with China, not just the movement of goods and trade, which the United States thought was part of America's future to be a rising power in Asia, but also the regulation of the movement of people, both Americans and Chinese. And so in the 1868 Burlingame Treaty, they had explicitly allowed, the two nations had allowed and stated that this exchange of people and goods would occur. And later with the Angel Treaty in 1880, they had narrowed this a little bit because there had been some pushback against Chinese immigration in the United States. But they expressly forbid. They agreed that the United States could not suspend Chinese immigration.
Mm-hmm.
And it was written into that treaty. And that's why the United States, this early law, the Chinese Restriction Act, was attempting to just implement that treaty in many ways. And so it was a bilateral agreement on how immigration between the United States and China would unfold. After the violence occurred, the United States again went to a bilateral solution first.
Yeah.
They went back to China and said, okay, we need to figure out a way to slow Chinese migration more. The Chinese diplomats agreed at first to implement.
Is this the Bayard-Chang Treaty?
Yeah, they agreed to this treaty proposed for basically self-exclusion by the Chinese, that the Chinese government would prevent Chinese immigrants from coming to the United States, which seemed like a great solution from the America's perspective. But then, although the treaty was ratified in the United States, it was not ratified in China, and instead the United States created their sort of first federal unilateral law to exclude a particular group in 1888, and they called that law the Chinese Exclusion Act.
So, and this kind of then really cements the imbalance in this international relationship where we're asking them to keep their doors open to trade and commerce, but we're closing our own gates, which is kind of the world in which we operate today. And I think how most, like as you say, we read back onto the past, the assumption that the United States has always exerted its sovereignty by saying who can and cannot enter the country, and that other countries just have to deal with it, right?
Yeah.
But we have this fascinating moment where that's not the case. I mean, at this point, this is kind of the first time when we start to have actual legal versus illegal immigrants, right?
Yes.
Which is the world we live in now, and we assume that's the way it always was, but it was not. So then we have a series of acts after this, like 1892. Well, because it's up for reauthorization every 10 years, right?
Yes.
And over the course of the next few decades, it's tightened down further and further, and some of the exemptions for merchants or families are stripped out. And then when do we finally get kind of an attempt at a full exclusion?
Well, it's really iterative in many ways. That the Gary Act in 1892 adds in a sort of passport and registration system that was seen, which again today we think of
Like,
that as a
passports,
normal part. Yes, a normal part of immigration. But at the time, the Chinese saw this as a huge humiliation, and it was seen as extreme and controversial. The idea that you would make people register themselves and carry with them passports, asserting their identity. The Chinese sometimes describe this as a dog tag law.
Mm-hmm.
If it gives you
They're
a
having
sense
to be
of
registered like livestock or something.
Yes,
right?
yes, branded in some, metaphorical way. And then in subsequent decades, that one of the things that happens is the Chinese exclusion laws are pushed into the insular territories. So it's
Philippines, Hawaii.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And then it's permanently renewed in 1904. and Chinese exclusion is then not repealed until the middle of World War II when the United States is allies with China in 1943.
That always shocks my students.
Yes.
And we often forget that China was our ally. That's kind of like a real forgotten story in World War II is, what's going on in China.
Yeah.
So after Roosevelt signs it in indefinitely, no need for renewal, we're left then with we're still left with Chinese populations in the United States. We have those who were here legally. They're not coming in after, but they don't have a path to citizenship. So they're left, they're here, but they're in kind of ambiguous legal ground, I guess. But then you also have American-born Chinese in those populations, but who are still suffering from this perception of being alien, right?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to me that there are different legal statuses that Chinese migrants occupied during this period, during Chinese exclusion, and they had real different meaning legally. It mattered whether you were an American-born Chinese and therefore a U.S. citizen by birth, or if you were a merchant and therefore an alien ineligible to citizenship, a Chinese merchant coming over, or if you
But
were
a legal
yes,
alien.
legal,
Yeah.
or if you were unlawful in some way,
Uh-huh.
what many Chinese called paper sons or paper daughters. So those legal categories in some level mattered, and they mattered to people individually in daily life as well as the moments in which they crossed the border. But in other ways, the fact that the federal immigration laws targeted the Chinese and as a national group, and the Chinese only for decades, meant that just being Chinese, being perceived as Chinese, that racial category mattered as well in your daily
Mm-hmm.
life. So the fact that there were some Chinese that were unlawful then affected the way that all Chinese people were seen and treated. A lot of them were treated as, as May Nai calls the alien citizens. And I think
Yeah.
that category is a little more specific than what I'm talking about here, but it means that essentially there's racial profiling, right? There's an assumption that all Chinese people are alien in some way and likely to be unlawfully present.
Yeah. And this stigma, then this goes on for generations then,
Yes.
amongst these communities. It's fascinating how, again, we read history kind of like with reverse teleology, and we forget the contingency of what was happening at the moment, and we read our modern assumptions on these paths, and then when we go back to these moments that you talk about, we realize that how in flux it all was, and how not certain all these things were, which I think for the listeners of this podcast and others, immigration is on everyone's mind. And it's helpful to be reminded that the evolution of American immigration policies and citizenship and who's foreign and who's alien and who belongs, who doesn't, it's a much more complex and messy history than we realize.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of what the study of history is to try to understand these pasts in which the parameters of I don't know, the assumptions of a society, of a state, of a people are foreign to us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, do you have any final comments about what makes this a uniquely Western story? And I mean, of course, a lot of it you're talking about Seattle and Tacoma and Rock Springs, Wyoming. There's a lot of Western geography here. And this is a Western podcast, supposedly. But are there ways in which you feel that this story unfolded in specific ways because it happened in the West, or ways in which, for whatever reason, the Chinese had all immigrated to New York City? How did this unfold differently because it was happening in the West? Kind of in these moments of Western expansion and the frontier and the growth of American settler colonialism and kind of our attempts to populate, these Western landscapes. How does that make this a unique story?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure.
Sorry, I should have emailed you that beforehand.
That's a big one. I think there's lots of ways that it's Western.
Or maybe let me reframe. The fact that it is Western, how does that make it a different story than it would have been maybe elsewhere? I mean, I sometimes think about when I teach the West, I talk with students about, again, not to use the word contingency again, but to talk about how this was a region that was in, still, it was contested. It was contested ground in terms, sometimes militarily contested, but, in terms of society and culture and religion and economics and commerce and who is going to dominate, who is going to kind of run the area. It was often in flux, and that's in play, I think, in the 1880s. Does that impact this?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I talk a lot about how everyone, all of the white Americans, but also the, European immigrants, who are Americans in waiting that arrive in
Hmm.
the West, are all involved in forms of imperialism. But I think that one of the things that's striking to me, and it becomes very clear when we look at people's attitudes towards the Chinese, is that they imagine themselves to be involved in different forms of imperialism. So the white working class of the West is actively investing in settler colonialism and in transforming the West into an American society that is recognizable to the Eastern states. But I think that the white American elite in these Western territories, especially in places like Washington Territory and California, bordering on the Pacific Ocean, are thinking forward towards a different kind of imperialism, overseas expansion into Asia, and the fact that that is sort of the future of American commerce and greatness, and that simply colonizing and settling the Western lands is just one step in this broader broader form of imperialism. And so that becomes very that tension is felt throughout the expulsion of the Chinese, exclusion of the Chinese, as the working class very much are. We don't want Chinese in our backyard. We don't want to compete with them. And the elites say, well, wait a second. We're involved in a larger project here of attempting to gain dominance in Asia, and perhaps the Chinese can be helpful to us. But both groups hold racial stereotypes and prejudice against the Chinese, but they see them very differently. And I think that sort of dual project of imperialism is a Western story.
That's fascinating. I mean, at one point you mentioned, yeah, that the coastal elites, they're not just trying to make money here in the United States, and perhaps using Chinese labor in their, lumber or mining operations or whatever else to make money here, but that coastal elite is looking further west, to Asia, hoping to also make money there, right?
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
um, our relationship with China for them is meaningful because they're hoping to be at the top of the pile, right? They're hoping to run the show and I mean, this is why Europeans came here in the first place, right? Trying to get to Asia. And so you now have
Yes.
the Western coastal elite seeing that they might potentially be the ones running the whole show. Yeah, which is very different than the white working class who maybe is upset about losing jobs or feeling threatened by kind of the foreign nature of Chinese, and wanting them out.
Yeah. I think it's essential. I mean, I think that Western history has been increasingly doing a very good job grappling with the settler colonialism that occurs in the West across the 19th century. But I think it is linked and driven in many ways by the dreams, at least, of imperialism in Asia. And we kind of
Hmm.
have to put those two conversations together as part of a larger Western story.
Yeah, as kind of the natural extension of,
Yeah.
I mean, American expansion. We get to the coast and we keep going,
Yep.
um, but often with some of the same underlying motivations. Um,
Mhm.
our manifest destiny, we're not quite satisfied, are we?
No, seems not.
Well, I appreciate you taking some time this morning to chat. What can we expect next from you, Beth?
Ah,
I don't
Um,
want, and I always I always ask this question, and then I realize like, oh, I don't. Maybe I'm asking them to spoil what their next project is. But is there anything you're willing to reveal about what you're working on next?
Um, I'll tell you, I can tell you a tentative title. Does
How
that
about
sound
that?
like a good?
Yeah.
I'm working on a book project that I'm calling right now, at least, John Doe Chinaman.
Oh
And
boy.
it's an attempt to understand sort of the internal regulation of race and alienage through criminal and civil law. So we understand what the regulation of race looks like in the Jim Crow South at the same time, but we have very little understanding how sort of color lines,
Hmm.
but also lines of foreignness are regulated in daily life through local law.
Oh, I think that sounds great. That's enough to whet our appetites, but not enough for anyone to scoop you, I don't think. So, which I know is unfortunately always a concern, but that sounds great. Well, congrats on the book, on the awards, and thanks for chatting with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us on this podcast. Writing Westward is a production of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. I'm Brenden Rensink, and I serve here as the host, producer, and engineer, and pretty much everything else of the podcast. So if you have any praise or critique, I guess you can probably send it my way. I also serve here at the Redd Center as the assistant director and as an assistant professor in the Department of History. So please contact me if you have any questions, not just about the podcast, but about the Redd Center, our events, our funding, or anything else. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. You can find him at micahdahl.anderson.com. That's Micah, D-A-H-L, Anderson with an O.com. I'll go ahead and include a link in the episode description. If you live here in the Intermountain West, let me also mention our digital public history project, Intermountain Histories. You can visit it at intermountainhistories.org or download the free mobile app by searching for Intermountain Histories on your Apple or Android devices. With this website and free mobile app, you can explore and read carefully curated histories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more. Each is researched and written by students and professors at universities around the region. Otherwise, please subscribe to the podcast or follow us on Facebook or Twitter to receive notification when the next episode goes live. We have many more fascinating conversations on the horizon and hope that you'll join us.